During the ANC's long years in exile, President Mbeki had earned an economics degree from Sussex University in Britain. Other economics lessons that registered with him during this time included the unpleasant fates of African and Latin American leaders who had embarked their governments on free spending policies to help the poor until the money ran out. He had noted the contrasting and successful political careers of Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the U.S. They curbed the power of labor unions, cut budgets of programs of assistance to the poor, reduced the tax obligations of the wealthy, and they were not run out of office. South Africa, Mbeki knew, presented a far greater leadership challenge than the US or UK. The disparity of great wealth and massive, all-encompassing poverty was more severe, much more. Not only was the wealthy minority white in color and the poor majority black and brown, but this class and color divide had been born of a history of conquest, dispossession, and a premeditated, long-standing policy of imposing money taxes on moneyless black peasants on pain of imprisonment in order to convert them into a cheap labor force. This deliberate creation of more poverty had been added to the poverty left in the wake of conquest and land seizures. How could Mbeki resist the temptation to make apartheid's beneficiaries rapidly transfer wealth to the system's victims? But he knew what the upshot of this would be. Apartheid's main beneficiaries would leave the country in numbers greater than those already fleeing from the upsurging crime. With them would go the tax revenue they supplied, and the investment South Africa had made in developing their skills. But to hold spending down for the poor while requiring little or no sacrifice from apartheid's beneficiaries outraged the trade union leadership and the Communist Party. Political survival demanded that key supporters who had succeeded in making Mbeki deputy president, then president, had to be rewarded, not only for hoisting him into leadership, but to ensure they would now stick with him and his unpopular conservative policy. From exile and years of struggle, they had accumulated no assets. Now several drew government salaries. Rewards for them would have to be in addition to their salaries. A vehicle for this were kickbacks made possible by an arms deal. But Mbeki would need broader support than from the few benefiting from the arms deal if his opponents in the Union and Communist leadership were to be checked. Substantial groups of additional supporters had to be built from scratch. A better life for them had to be achieved quickly, even if the extra and often uneconomic expense this would entail left less in the kitty to achieve a better life for all. The arms deal had energized backing for Mbeki and his policies from the few, like the Minister of Defense, in position to arrange private side deals for themselves. However, Mbeki and his government had also been engineering a considerably broader base of support in the form of a new black middle class and the nucleus of an upper class. Their rapid emergence improved Mbeki's prospect of riding out the growing challenge from the left. Prior to liberation, few Africans managed a middle-class manner of life. Among the few, at one time, were Nelson Mandela, who came from the Tembu ruling dynasty, and his law partner, future president of the ANC in exile, Oliver Tambo, here on the left, who had received a scholarship to attend Fort Hare University from an assembly of chiefs. But the destiny of most Africans was to provide whites with cheap labor. It was against the law for an African to own shares in a public company. It was against the law for Africans to open a gas station, or a dry cleaners, or a bank, or a factory, even in the segregated African townships ringing the cities. Taxi businesses specializing in transporting township residents to their places of work were tolerated. There were small groceries, illegal drinking establishments, shebeens, in people's homes. But, according to a minister of Native Affairs, for an African, quote, to trade in competition with white traders is not something which I am prepared to tolerate, unquote. The ANC had swept to power, promising a better life for all. Surely living conditions of the most burdened township residents would now improve. Clean water would be piped in. Bucket sanitation replaced by a cleaner method. Jobs organized for the long-term unemployed. Certainly the will was there, from Mbeki down through all levels of the ANC. But the will was one thing, the way another. To keep the ANC's promise made during the settlement negotiations to pay off all the former apartheid regime's debts and all pensions owed to its officials and officers, this alone would claim a good share of the budget. While to find sufficient money to help all victims of white domination by heavily taxing apartheid's beneficiaries would cause even more whites to leave the country, thus subtracting their skills and tax payments from the economy. To do nothing was impossible. How could ANC politicians continue to enjoy their new official salaries and perks unless the lives of at least part of their electorate got better? Some politically ordered transfer of wealth and economic advantage from white to black had to occur, and rapidly, despite resulting losses of skills, foreign investment, and revenue. A better life for some would increase the number of government supporters and guard against the disappointment of the millions who would have to wait. The economic costs incurred through improving the lives of some would inevitably lengthen this wait, but that also couldn't be helped. Work to create a black middle class was pressed first in the country's huge public sector. Public service accounts for more than 1 out of every 4 paychecks in South Africa, from directors general of government ministries down to track laborers on the national railways. The goal was to achieve for 3 groups identified as having suffered most from unfair past discrimination, namely, black people, women, and people with disabilities, positions in all branches and at all levels of public service, commensurate with their numerical representation in the general population. There was little new here. For example, the Malaysian government in 1971 established a policy of ethnic and racial preferences aimed at boosting the economic share of the majority segment of the country's population, indigenous Malays or Bumiputras, from 2.4 to 30%. The rest remaining in the hands of Chinese Malaysians, Indian Malaysians, and foreigners. The policy was racial-based and not deprivation-based. For instance, all Bumiputra regardless of their financial standing, became entitled to a 7% discount on houses or property, including luxurious units, whilst a low-income Chinese or Indian Malaysian citizen received no such benefit. As for South Africa, the policy instituted by the ANC government was the third time in the country's 20th century history that race or ethnicity have been used by its governments as their main hiring guide for the public service. We've already seen how, after the defeat of the two Boer republics in the Anglo-Boer War, Britain's High Commissioner in South Africa, Lord Milner, and his team worked to restaff the public service of the occupied Boer republics with English-speaking whites, many only recent immigrants from Britain, in order, as Milner put it, to break the dominion of Afrikanerdom. In the private sphere, Afrikaner job seekers were shunned. White English-speaking employers also said no to Afrikaners applying even for unskilled jobs, hiring instead Africans who were legally barred from forming unions or engaging in strikes. The second application of racial and ethnic hiring preferences in South Africa occurred after Afrikaner nationalist governments came to power, later in the 20th century. By this time, just under half of all white families, overwhelmingly Afrikaner families, were living on charity or deemed too poor to adequately feed and clothe their children. Afrikaner nationalist governments prohibited private employers, in general still predominantly white English speakers, from basing their hiring solely upon economic considerations. Instead, an entire series of jobs were reserved by law for whites, in effect mainly for Afrikaners. In the public sector, thousands of unskilled blacks, from government office sweepers to laborers on the railways, were dismissed and replaced by unskilled whites, generally Afrikaners, at higher pay. Huge state enterprises were established to produce iron and steel, convert coal into oil, etc., in which Afrikaans was the language of the board of directors. Deposits by government of public money, such as tax receipts, helped a small Afrikaner bank to become one of the country's major banks. By the 1980s, Afrikaners were well represented in the upper levels of commerce, manufacturing, and mining. They were in full charge of the military, and their per capita income had risen to about 80% of English speakers' earnings. Yet even as Afrikaners were closing in on the more than century-long economic lead of white English speakers, that contest ended abruptly with the unforeseen acquisition of state control by Africans. For the third time in the century, the preferred racial and ethnic identities were changed. Those long disadvantaged were now to be the advantaged. To have merely repealed all discriminatory apartheid laws would not have placed South Africans on a level field. Because persons no longer were barred from attending a university or from being considered for a job because of their color or ethnicity, did not in itself correct for the fact that 5 times as much had been spent on educating each white child as on each black child. The end of apartheid did not confer skills and experiences employers were interested in. Unless new racial preferences were established by the state, the effects of the old racial preferences would persist for a generation or more. teachers trained to an inferior standard during the apartheid era would be in charge of class after class of children, including children who would become themselves teachers. A level playing field was far, far off. For Mbeki and his colleagues, a wait of even one generation was politically impossible. They needed an immediate material improvement in the lives at least of some. But there was a problem. When the change to black rule began, whites dominated the public sector. 98% of directors general and their deputies were white. Thousands even of unskilled jobs in the public sector were held by descendants of the former poor whites. Moreover, the agreement under which whites handed power over in 1994 protected all white public servants in their jobs for a sunset period of 5 years. Thus, to create openings quickly in every branch and at every level of public service for persons formerly excluded, the government had no choice but to offer attractive early retirement and voluntary severance packages to the incumbents. Tacked on to the cost of these hefty severance packages were additional billions of rands spent to re-engage many of the former white managers and professionals as consultants, in effect a parallel civil service, to help their replacements with work for which an inferior apartheid educational system had left them unprepared. This expensive solution was less costly than an unsustainable program to provide the millions of unemployed with government-paid work. Within 7 years, more than half the top managers in the civil service were African, and more than 3/4 of the public service as a whole was African, colored, and Indian. Without question, a better life for some was achieved quickly. But there were also minuses. Public funds spent on severance packages and consultants to make possible immediate employment for numbers of the formerly disadvantaged were funds unavailable to shorten the wait of others for their promised better life. As the public service was rapidly being made black from top to bottom, the larger black population was dividing increasingly into winners and losers. One illustration is the changing makeup of the police service and the operation of the police service. As for its makeup, the police service became top-heavy. In the U.S. in 2002, there were 6.4 patrolmen or patrolwomen for every sergeant. In South Africa, there were then 4 sergeants for every constable. Constables made up only 7% of the force, which included a disproportionately large number of senior officers who drew salaries 10 times greater than the constables. Insufficient funds were left to develop the force's skills. 12 years after liberation, 60% of the police station force lacked driving licenses. Forensic equipment was absent. No surprise that South Africa had one of the lowest prisoner per murder rates in the world, despite having one of the highest homicide rates, and being, as Interpol put it, quote, in undisputed first place as far as reported cases of rape are concerned. Numbers of the emerging black middle class were joining whites behind the walls and guard posts of the thousands of new gated communities. Defenses bordering individual homes were strengthened. Soon, more people were employed by private security firms to fulfill the state's chief responsibility to protect persons and property than the entire police and military service combined. Their signs were posted everywhere. Tongue-in-cheek images were uploaded on the internet to give the impression that police stations also were under the protection of the private security firms. Only persons at the top of the business and political pyramids were safe, and then only while traveling with bodyguards. Nelson Mandela's 4 grandchildren were robbed in the driveway of his daughter's Johannesburg home. Future President Jacob Zuma was mugged near ANC headquarters in Johannesburg. The wife of Tokyo Sexwale, a former fellow prisoner with Nelson Mandela on Robben Island, later president of South Africa's richest province, still later a billionaire business tycoon, was held up while dropping off her children at a prestigious private school in a wealthy area. South Africa came in at 126 of 131 countries ranked for safety from crime by the World Economic Forum's 2007 Global Competitiveness Survey. It didn't help that Jackie Selebi, South Africa's police commissioner, also for several years president of Interpol, was accepting bribes from and providing secret police intelligence to a notorious mobster who was to face trial for extortion, drug running, and murder. Selebi had had no previous experience of police work, but he was an important supporter of Mbeki's on the ANC's national executive. Mbeki tried to protect him by suspending the country's chief prosecutor, who had refused to drop the case against Selebi. But the suspension brought Mbeki problems he was unable to solve. A judge's intervention eventually led to Selebi receiving a 15-year prison sentence. Both Mbeki's political need to protect his corrupt police commissioner from prosecution and his failure to accomplish this shows how far South Africa's second president was being driven off course. Thus, he well understood that economic growth required that the country at least halt the outflow of scientific and technological personnel, most of whom were white. Their exodus had begun in the waning years of the apartheid regime before the ANC came to power. To stem the outflow would have required establishing an effective police service and ending affirmative action. But he had to counter the vehement opposition of organized workers to his business-friendly policies. How else to do this, other than by speedily building up an order of people who would actually experience the promised better life? If this process was not to take forever, affirmative action was essential. It meant, as an ANC member put it approvingly, getting, quote, rid of merit as the overriding principle in the appointment of public servants. For many of the remaining skilled whites, especially younger ones in the 35 to 49-year-old age group, it meant a closed door to their future job advancement. Prospects in Australia and elsewhere seemed better, plus the much smaller chance of becoming a victim of crime. Thus the outflow that began in the violent days before apartheid ended continued. By 2006, more than a third of South Africa's municipalities lacked a single civil engineer, technologist, or technician. Affirmative action spread its effects, from the diminishing number of the country's civil engineers to a diminishing supply of clean water for drinking and for agriculture and industry. As one of the drier countries in the world, South Africa registers average annual rainfall at roughly half the global average. Already, by 1998, 98% of the national water resource had been allocated. 10 years later, the country's Council for Scientific and Industrial Research was told the entire resource was in full use, with no additional supplies available for allocation. Not only was water scarcity itself constraining economic growth, progressive contamination of the limited supply was making the problem worse. Small towns lacking skilled wastewater treatment personnel and equipment were pumping millions of gallons of untreated or inadequately treated sewage into South Africa's rivers and streams, where it was reaching major population centers as here, East London. Microcystine toxins, which attack the liver, were being registered in reservoirs at levels among the highest in the world. We return later to other consequences of the emigration of public sector scientific and technological personnel. But first, rapid racial transformation was also pursued in the private sector. The private economy accounted for roughly 9 out of 10 jobs. Hiring and managerial decisions here were not in the hands of government ministers and appointees. Yet the government was not powerless. Without backtracking on the 1994 settlement that had left the property rights of whites constitutionally entrenched, the ANC government nevertheless was able to enact laws to reshape how businesses in South Africa were run, whom they hired, even the racial composition of their management and ownership. Termed Black Economic Empowerment, BEE for short. This, together with affirmative action in the public sector, helped bring about one of the largest and swiftest reallocation of wealth and opportunity between groups within a society without revolution. Already, by the year 2000, only 16 years after liberation, black consumers for the first time outspent whites, and nearly 1/4 of the richest tenth of the population was black. Businesses with more than 50 employees were required to submit to the government affirmative action plans, setting targets and timetables for the employment of the historically disadvantaged at every level of the business, from unskilled to top management. Black economic empowerment also encompassed business ownership. Legislation in 2003 prescribed black ownership percentages for branches of the private sector. Thus, 50% of the equity of mining houses had to be in black control by 2008, and 26% by 2013. To comply with this, companies offered to sell the number of shares that would satisfy the required ownership percentage at a discounted rate to members of previously disadvantaged groups. These persons, even with few if any funds of their own, nevertheless could obtain bank loans for buying the shares, which, because of the price discount, were worth more to the bank as collateral than the amount of the loan. Businesses were required to submit certificates verified by SANAS, the South African National Accreditation Service, reporting their degree of compliance with each of the 7 empowerment criteria. The 7 criteria were differentially weighted. Thus, a maximum of 20 points out of 100 points total score could be earned for degree of black ownership. Up to 10 points could be earned for black management control, and so on. Points could be earned for skills development, depending on the percentage of payroll spent on training black staff. Up to 20 points out of the 100 total could be earned for preferential procurement, calculated on how much of the company's supplies were purchased from other BEE companies. The higher their Black Economic Empowerment total score, the greater the purchasing company's own preferential procurement rating would be. Up to 15 points could be earned for enterprise development. That is, providing technical and management training for free or at a discount to an emerging Black-owned business. Up to 5 points could come from socio-economic development, that is, by paying the rent, telephone, or other overhead costs of an emerging Black business, or providing it with accounting or legal services at cost or at a discount. This packaging company reported in 2010 that 50% of its shares were owned by Black men and Black women. On the left are its reported scores for each of the 7 elements, as against maximum possible scores on the right. The fact that nearly 1/3 of government spending, roughly $100 billion in 2008 to 9, were government purchases from private vendors, was a powerful incentive to achieve the highest possible BEE score, since this score could outweigh even a competitor's price advantage in the bidding for a government contract. Here, businessmen are attending a tendering workshop to study the nuts and bolts relationship between price bids and the Black Economic Empowerment Scorecard in government contracting. Did Black economic empowerment depress businesses' bottom line? Certainly, businesses sold off some of their shares at below market value, made appointment and hiring decisions to conform to government policy, even took on the expenses of other businesses. But this was not entirely involuntary. It made business sense to develop a financial interest in the success of their businesses among well-connected Africans, especially high-level members of the African National Congress, by bringing them on board as part owners or as directors. Thus, 4 ANC members were appointed to the board of one of the country's largest engineering firms. Among them, Matthews Fosa, first Premier of Mpumalanga Province, and after 2007, Treasurer General of the African National Congress. 10 other companies placed him on their boards. He assisted a formerly all-white Afrikaner law firm, Du Toit Smuts, to become fully compliant with Black economic empowerment obligations, with the result that Du Toit Smuts and Matthews Fosa Incorporated, as it became known, grew into the biggest law firm in Mpumalanga Province. There are numerous other examples. The 87-member ANC National Executive Committee, the ruling party's highest decision-making body, elected in 2007, included 28 individuals with interest in 69 companies, including property development, mining, petroleum, financial services, publishing, and weapons development. Several had become billionaires, like Tokyo Sexwale, one-time Robben Island political prisoner, later premier of one of the provinces, and Cyril Ramaphosa, former union leader and key negotiator of the 1994 political settlement. 14 years before the first democratic election, no Black directors served on any of the boards of companies listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. 14 years after the beginning of majority rule, there was at least one Black director on the boards of 64% of the listed companies. A short time previously, English-speaking business leaders had been recruiting Afrikaners onto their boards. An Afrikaner nationalist government was then in charge, and it was dispensing lucrative public contracts. The wheel of history, of course, had turned. However, this time, efforts by white English-speaking and Afrikaner business executives to bring members of the new political elite on board were fixed on more than short-term bottom-line calculations. Black share owners and managers, they anticipated, would stand with them against any attempt at nationalization of their businesses. Members of the white business community also recognized that they needed to support the rapid buildup of a broadly defined black middle class. A black middle class stood to present an effective buffer against populist revolt. In addition to a few hundred well-connected, very wealthy black families, by 2008 there were nearly 3 million other men and women who were beneficiaries one way or another of the government's empowerment policies. Some were holding down jobs that only brought in the equivalent in rands of $747 a month. But this was enough to rent a little house with indoor plumbing on a street not rank with overflowing outhouse waste. Children of domestic servants and laborers had utilized no longer racially restricted educational opportunities. Some had started small businesses of their own. Their good fortune did not pass unnoticed by those left behind, whose numbers, as we shall see, were growing.
Usamache baba umfaka ipeta nguke lapha solo hover Linga mama bala no bazala linga, uwe bezila linga.